Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us. I'm Simon Pollock. I'm an experienced designer here at Oxygen, and I'm also your host and moderator for today's discussion, Modernizing Your Learning and Enablement Operating Model. If you're new to our online conversations at Oxygen, we prepare people and their businesses for what's next. That's because change is inevitable, especially in a world beset by a global crisis, one that's driven companies across industries to rebuild their organizations and operating models, all to accommodate hybrid work and more digital services, and a ground that continues to change, a landscape that continues to change. So we help leaders re-envision and design and launch new ways of working that in turn help deliver modern role-based, scenario-based learning experiences to the employees that need it. It's complicated work. Changing an operating model can have seismic effects on an organization. It can affect many, many people. And today we're joined by three experts who have guided people across industries through these major changes. I'd first like to introduce Juliana Stancampiano, Oxygen's CEO. Hi, Juliana. We're
I have to
also
unmute myself.
Oh, there
Sorry.
you go. Yeah, it's all
Hi,
good.
Simon.
Hi. We're also joined by Rob Osach, Oxygen's Vice President of Enterprise Solutions. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Simon. Great to be here.
And last, but far from least, is Catherine Shao, Oxygen's Vice President of our Sales Enablement Practice. I know we've got a bunch to talk about today, so we're going to get the conversation started. For everyone on the line with us, please feel free to use the Q&A function to send us your questions. We want you to participate as well. But for now, I'll get us started. And Juliana, I'm going to pick on you to open things up. Operating models. What are some of the major drivers behind the need for having one?
Yeah, so this is kind of funny, actually, because I was just on another live event this morning, and there were some questions that came up in that call, and it made me think, well, that harkens back to the operating model. And so I think the irony is that on our slide, we have things that are very large, right? Mergers, acquisitions, major product launches, a new market you're going into. These are all strategic business reasons why you might need to change your operating model. And then on the call that we had this morning, what was kind of interesting, and I think worth a discussion, is that one of the questions was around, how do you know how much money is going into something and what your ROI is? And it made me realize that, operating models are also driven from the ground up, because the answer per se to that question is, well, you need some structure in place so that you can understand what your intake is, and you can understand that, with the business, what services you're offering. And then once you have these things defined, you can figure out how you're going to offer them and what the ROI is that you're looking at with these offerings, and then how you're going to measure it from a business measurement perspective. So it was kind of interesting to me that a lot of times I think we view it from these large strategic things that are happening, and that is absolutely a reason why we've been brought in to work on an operating model. And yet there's also a lot of learning and development or sales enablement groups are started from the ground up. It's one person that comes in and starts working on something, and then it's a next person, and then a next person. And then at some point within the growth, you have to start to put some structure around it and create an operating model that maybe didn't exist in the beginning. So I think, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. And I think it depends on, the maturity of an organization, where they're at, and why they would be looking at the operating model. But I'd be curious to know. I haven't talked to Catherine and Rob since I was on that call, so I'm kind of curious to know what their perspective is on that kind of aha moment for me this morning.
Well, I think I love the fresh take, because we didn't even have a chance to talk about that, because immediately what came to mind to me was around what are the needs of the business, and associated with the needs of the business is you have to orient around value and an outcome. And underneath that, this is part of the operating model construct, is how do you get alignment on what is the outcome and what's the measurement around the ROI, or what the value is that's going to be delivered. And ultimately, you have to get alignment on what's the service to help drive the need, the outcome, and the measurement underneath it, and using it in business language. I think that's the key thing. A lot of times we've seen in the past where whether it's an IT organization, a marketing organization, or learning organization, they speak in terms of their language, but not in terms of the business. What do you think, Catherine?
I definitely agree that there's that translation here, and I actually, you just mentioned services, you just mentioned outcomes. I thought I would just show this image because that whole why behind the operating model, I think it's very easy to kind of rotate right into the, well, what are the deliverables and what kind of thing are we going to create? Yeah. And we're really talking about taking a step back into the whole engine that is really going to drive the creation of those things in repeatable ways or scalable ways, or ways in which we can deal with all this change. Because the change, every business, everybody knows that that's not going to go away anytime soon. And so in my mind, what you just said, Rob, really speaks to the idea of having something in place, having that structure that's going to allow that whole part of the organization to adapt to what's coming and what's happening.
Yeah, I think as I kind of think about these two different ways, I think if you're in a smaller group and you're just creating your structure, in my mind, that seems like an easier place to be, right? Because you can start thinking about the structure kind of from day one and map out from a growth perspective where you're going to go. And then a lot of the customers we've worked with are very large. They have a structure in place, and they've decided that it's not going to serve them moving forward and that it needs to change. And that kind of change, I think, to Simon's introduction earlier, is complex. It takes time. It's not always easy. In fact, it might be hard. And there's so much richness from a development perspective that you get along the way when you do those changes, and watch people get further upskilled and developed within their roles, or moving into different types of roles that they are aligned to. So that is kind of an interesting view on it. And from our paradigm, it's working within the very large organizations that are 50 to 150 people supporting thousands of people around the world, and that kind of scope versus, if I'm new to this and I have a few people in my group, how do I start structuring? Where do I start with that structure and progressing it so that it can scale through time? Because scale, as we know, is, the magic, right? The magic answer to everything.
And it's hard. It's one of the hardest parts to do, right? To do something well and do it over and over and over, make it repeatable.
So to that point,
and go ahead, Simon.
Sorry. To that point, Rob, I'm wondering, what type of role and what type of skill set do you typically see from a person who's leading that scaling effort?
Well, it has to be the person that's running the organization. And I think Catherine and Juliana can speak to this probably better than I, because we help the leaders communicate and navigate a sea of stakeholders. And that's where a lot of the large heavy lifting is how do you communicate to different types of stakeholders in the organization, whether it's your partners or internal vendors like IT, your executive sponsor, or your customers. What's that vernacular that you need to have? And how do you articulate the business case and the value proposition and the services you're building out and the investment that's required, and then the corresponding, as we talked about earlier, the ROI or the value of the impact. There's a lot of work that's got to be done by the shared service leader to navigate all that and communicate value.
It's interesting, Rob, the language that you use in terms of the services, and there's even a word here on the slide that delivering a service to that internal or even external customer, and what is the service strategy, and making sure that there is that type of structure set up. I think that is why we look to the leader of an organization, because that's the mindset that they're going to have in terms of running a whole entire enablement team and thinking about who their stakeholders are and trying to navigate that. And we've seen at the large companies, it can get incredibly complicated. Every stakeholder group can be different. There can be different groups in different regions. There can be more centralized groups, and everybody needs something. And so having that ability to deliver services is really, really important, and an important part of the language, I think, that we use to talk about what's in an operating model.
And I think that can be even more complicated when you're in a merger environment where there's all kinds of restructuring going on.
Yes.
So you're in competition with your peers to who's got the best value proposition. So you have to be a salesperson, really.
Yeah.
Well, and also I would say, I think from a learning and development perspective, at least, what we've learned is it's kind of the last of many, different parts of an organization to be held to business outcomes. And that's just an emerging thing for the L&D groups. And so do they get the time in a merger and acquisition, and funding to do the things that need to be done, which to me, there's a lot of irony in that, since they're also responsible for upskilling and developing all of the people, under their remit. And so if you don't invest in that group, you're not investing ultimately in the people and then in the business and the outcomes that you're trying to drive. And it's always been such a dichotomy to me that we don't measure L&D to business outcomes, because it is the lifeline and kind of lifeblood for your people, and to make sure that you're ready, or they're ready for what's coming next, so that you're, stay on the forefront and don't become, irrelevant.
Great.
That's interesting to me, Juliana, because I'm like, I feel like if I was a big, like a CSO, perhaps a chief strategy officer, I'd be wanting to think about the operating models across my organizations. And like, if I'm modernizing one, then the other ones probably fit somewhere in my pipeline of what I want to modernize and adapt for. Why is L&D where it is, and what's holding a lot of organizations back?
Well, I think because it's not measured, it's hard to say how valuable it is. So, sales can show their value, and the product side can show their value, right? They've got the metrics, they've got the business measurements, they're aligned with the strategy, and rarely does L&D come to the table with any metrics to say that's of business results.
Yep.
They'll come and say, we put 60,000 people through learning events this year, say. What does that tell you as a leader? Tells you spend a bunch of money and time on people going through some stuff, but you have no idea what happened after said event. Are we better off for it? Did it move the needle? Are we making progress in an area that we needed to? Is our marketing stronger? Is our product development getting better? You just don't know. So as a CEO, you go, okay, great. So I'm going to put that in my overhead costs to manage instead of my investment side of the portfolio, because I don't know what value I'm getting.
I think you bring up such a, oh, go ahead, Rob.
I'm just going to say this, which is, I think the fundamental theme here is a key component of an operating model: have a good measurement strategy, good analytics reporting, and put it in business metrics or measures that you get alignment with your business partners on. Sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the whole question of measurement, it's such a, so interesting in the sense that we've done a lot of research into L&D organizations, and we've looked at a lot of third-party research, and the degree to which either L&D or even enablement of different various kinds really struggle to find those measurements. And we even did a webinar on it a couple episodes ago, just looking at how to break that down, because that tends to be something that some of the leaders that we talk about, they really, really struggle with how to capture the right information, and also just undoing the muscle memory that exists around, well, we're just going to, go with what's easy to measure versus what actually indicates the impact.
Yeah, it is interesting, because I don't want this to be all about measurement, and yet it does affect whether we get funding so that we can add more, so that we can modernize. How do we invest in our own people that are creating the stuff, for people, so that what we are creating is modern and of the moment. So there's a lot of knock-on effects of what you get or don't get if you can show the business case for it. And I think that's a core component of all the other parts, right? Do you need do you need investment in technology because your, technology is antiquated? Does that need to be upgraded? Do you need investment in your own people? Which I think the irony as well, when we have gone into organizations, is that the learning people aren't getting upskilled either.
Yep.
Right. So you have to upskill those people that are upskilling the rest of your organization, so that they stay fresh and relevant and ahead of what's going on. And I also think there's something to be said for kind of that employee experience metric added into the business outcomes, because, depending on attrition rates or turnover, we're going through, so sitting on the board for the SES, we've created one of parts of our conference called Turnover Tsunami, because people are seeing so much turnover on the marketplace right now. And how do you make sure that you retain the top talent and that those aren't the people walking out your door? And that's going to come down to, do they feel invested in? Do they feel like they're getting, career advancement, et cetera? So that whole employee experience is a core component as well to making sure that you're driving, people forward versus, stagnating or losing your top talent. Rob, you sound like you wanted to say something.
Oh, well, retention is becoming a business metric, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
helping people retain their employees through upskilling and reskilling is becoming more paramount with the pandemic. So I think you're bringing up a very salient, relevant point that we're going to continue to see in the coming months and years ahead.
Definitely. So I think what would be interesting is like, well, okay, so we need an operating model, or we need to start creating one, or we need to modernize it. How do we do that? Like, what does that look like if I was a leader? That's what I'd be kind of, I think, wondering right now. And am I, for my maturity, my organizational maturity, where are we, in the continuum of creating this?
Yeah, I think that's a question we often get asked is, where do we start? Well, we start with an assessment, and we also need to define what's the end state and the strategy or service strategy, and what's the gap that sits between the current state and that target state. That's the magic that we need to put together in a roadmap to tell us how to get to that end state and what needs to be built or modernized to get there. I think that's one of the most common questions, like, where do I start? Well, a simple assessment of your organization in terms of their capabilities, the process, the technology, can it deliver on the vision that you have for your organization?
I kind of like this, like, what's the jumping off point? That's essentially what we're getting at. Like, where are we starting and where are we headed, right? And once you get those two things defined, you're able to start filling in the middle, which is kind of ironic, because that's kind of how we do everything that we do. Is like,
It is.
Where are we at? Where are we going? And that helps us fill in the middle gap of what we need to do, and a timeline, and all of the different, components that go into such a massive shift.
Yeah, I think you guys both bring up a great point about what is it as well. I mean, there is the question of how and how you get started and doing the assessment. And we've done this enough to have a whole methodology around how we help businesses establish those operating models and put that vision in place. We do have this interesting slide that gets into what an operating model is. And I'm thinking maybe we could talk through this a little bit, because you've already touched on so many points around this.
Yeah, this feels like a Rob slide to me.
I'll get it started, but I think I would love for you
Go for
guys to talk about process. But fundamental, whenever there's a new leader comes in, and that's another driver, is we work with people that are new in role, that are been asked to drive change, is what's the structure need to look like, and what are the roles and responsibility, what's the head count. That kind of ties into the business case. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done around saying, well, what does my organization need to look like in terms of how I want to execute against the vision that I have? And what we often recommend is you bifurcate the organization a little bit, maybe pilot some new services or capabilities, and try not to dramatically, interrupt your current operations, so that we can model what we think the new roles and responsibilities could look like, and what the staffing might look like with that. Another key component that we haven't talked about, we talk about technology a little bit, but is process. And Oxygen wrote a whole book on process that I would love for Catherine and Juliana to expand on, because a big part of that is, can we be agile? Can we adapt to the business environment and offer things at speed? And in addition to impact and outcome.
Yeah, and I think, that's really part of kind of modernizing the way in which we work, right? So the Agile methodology is not new by any means, but it's definitely newer in the learning and enablement space. And yet I would say you have to do it now today, or else you're definitely being left behind. So if you don't have this in place, it's a great place to start. How do you create stuff and get it out there and test it and continue to make process improvements and continue to align it to your audience and make changes? Because the speed of business is changing, so rapidly. There's no longer product launches anymore. It's, iterative updates that we all are getting on our devices and phones, et cetera, that those are the changes that are coming. And so, the beginning of a year, something looks one way, and by the end of the year, it looks completely different. And we think about learning and development in that same way. How do you just keep making changes and keep making updates and make sure it's relevant and do it in a way that's quick and easy to a point? Catherine, what you would add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on the whole idea of that methodology and process that's part of this model. And yes, there's a book about that gets into the different stages of the methodology, but also the ways of working, which is part of what you're talking about too. I think that idea of being agile, even though it's not new, it is remarkably difficult to shift a mindset that is not used to working in a way that there's a open-mindedness to it. There's a responsiveness, which doesn't mean that people are working 24/7 at all. And in fact, there's quite a bit of really good balance, I think, that we've gotten on our team using these ways of working. And yet we can turn around stuff pretty fast. And it is partly because we have that process that we know how the work gets broken down so that there's no one person that's overburdened, so that a lot of the jobs that have to be done within a given project get done by the right people who have the right skills for that particular thing. And that's a big part of this whole methodology and process part of it.
Well, I would love for you guys to talk about the concept of Geffen. Good. I'll let you guys explain what that is, because I actually feel like that's a tenet of the business process. And it's a very simple process that people like me who are perfectionists, and I want the deliverable to be perfect. It doesn't always have to be perfect. So talk about that a little bit.
I love that acronym.
Yeah, Catherine definitely loves it. What I think I would say is that we strive for excellence, and on the way there, a lot of things are good enough for right now. So I think what slows us down a lot of times in life is exactly because you have a bunch of people on this call that probably have too many perfectionist tendencies, and we've interrupted our own work streams at points, or been called out to say it's good enough. We just have to keep moving. Right. So how do we get this mindset where and how do we help one another see it's actually good enough for where we're at right now? We need to put it in front of somebody else. We need to get feedback, and we need to keep making progress. And so that's really what that's about, is knowing when something's good enough to put in front of somebody else. And so you can continue with that process. Catherine, what have you got?
I think, yes, good enough doesn't mean not good. And which is sometimes how it's been interpreted, but you can also, some other organizations might use minimum viable product if they already have a culture that is really used to getting things out quickly and then improving on them. And always there's continuous improvement on something. It actually comes down to some of the requirements, which is another little area here on our diagram that's part of the methodology and process. Is, do we have the right requirements? Do we know whether or not the audience really needs something that's really polished and really, refined, or is it an audience that needs just the right and relevant information? And that oftentimes defines what good enough really is for that situation.
I think
you can't.
Sorry,
Rob.
I think you hit another key tenet that I want you guys to expand on, because I see this brilliance. It's the audience is at the center of everything we do, just like in the Agile manifesto and the IT people like me, the end users like the center, the customers the center, like you guys talk about the passion around the audience, right? So, what are the things that we do in our own business process to get that perspective from the audience? Sorry to interrupt you, Juliana, but
No, it's okay. I
No.
think, I was going to say, you can't say enough about gathering the requirements up front. How
Yeah.
many times have we been halfway through a project and then something lands and you go, we had no idea that that was a requirement, and you feel foolish and have to go back and do a bunch of rework. And so sometimes spending that time on gathering the requirements and making sure that you're driving clarity across your audience, right? So to Rob's point, like, it's not just about your internal group by any means. The requirements are out to your stakeholders, to your subject matter experts, to all these people that are going to be involved, because what slows you down and doesn't make you agile is learning about things, mid-project, 3/4 of the way through, or when you're about to push something out and then realizing that, your people in your call centers don't have access to sound on their machine, and you've just created a bunch of things with
Yep.
sound. Just the wasted time and effort with not knowing that is shocking. And so we are constantly focused on the audience. If it's going to be good for the audience, then we'll do it. If it's going to be, if it's a requirement from somebody who's not the audience because they just think that they know the audience better, we take that with a little bit of a lighter, kind of grain of salt type of view, because you really have to create stuff that people are going to want to engage with, and it's going to resonate, and it's going to make a difference for them. And they're going to be able to do something with it at work, because this gets all the way back to driving outcomes and being able to measure the ROI. If that's not your focus and your audience isn't your focus, then you're probably creating a lot of stuff that somebody thinks is the right answer, but nobody actually knows why.
And you're highlighting to me where I see the business process or the methodology being that glue between the outcomes and the vision and the scalability and the measurement. What I would say on top of everything you guys just said is, in terms of scaling, the process is foundational, because you have to standardize on a set of key activities, outputs, or deliverables, so that we have a common language from which we can operate from, both internally and externally, when we communicate what we're doing with our clients or internal customers.
Also helps with scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Clarity of words and assets and expectations, all those things. We continue to rip off Brené's Brown clear as kind. Doesn't mean it's always nice. It just means it's going to drive clarity and everybody is aligned. Super critical.
It's interesting too, because we've been talking about requirements, and yet there's these other components here around intake and demand management, which I think is interesting, because even before you get to requirements, you have to at least organize what's coming at you, especially if you're running a whole function and a whole team of people and you're trying to deliver something of value to various business constituents. There's got to be a way to organize what's coming at you from a demand perspective. I would love it, Rob, if you talked about that a little bit.
Well, I think we covered this in the last webinar too, which is you need to have a function, we call it business relationship management, where you're engaging with your customers on a regular cadence, because you got to understand what their needs are and what they're doing and what their requests are, so we can quantify those requests and prioritize those against other organizations that we're servicing. We actually use time tracking in some of the organizations we helped with this function, because the time tracking helps see what are people working on relative to our capacity, and can it meet our demand. This is a very hard, complex undertaking for people to do it at scale, which you have to have demand management and capacity planning as a foundational component for scaling. And you have to have a prioritization scheme that you have between you and your sponsors to make sure that you can adequately serve the demand with the capacity that you have.
Well, and I think there's different components to that. So this is critical, and it also drives clarity for your stakeholders of what you do and what you don't do.
Yeah, the service catalog.
Exactly. What services you offer, what services you don't offer. And it allows you to say, I hear that you need this. Who else needs this in the organization? Like, is this something that our function should be taking on, or is this a one-off thing that, somebody in the field needs to just go and find a solution for themselves? The other aspect that I always want to touch on with the time tracking is exactly to what Rob said, and then doubling down on, it's more about understanding how time is spent so that we can manage what is needed to do the work that's going to be coming in. It's not about micromanaging somebody's work and, telling them that they haven't done enough work, or, driving performance management through time tracking. And it's taken us even a long time, and as new people come in at Oxygen, to break them of the like, this isn't meant to, micromanage that. But there's a lot of ill will towards time tracking in different industries because it has been used for evil, I would say, versus the reality of just trying to manage your business the best way that you can.
We actually used that in a business case to get the funding needed to show that we did not have the resources necessary to show what the other picture we had, which was the capacity or the demand of what our customers were requesting. So if we show the demand of what the needs are from the organization, which we work with our business partners and our customers on, and show that against our capacity, that often is the vehicle to help you get the funding you need to get the right staffing model in place. What do you think, Catherine?
I think it's, yes, the data matters. The right data matters to collect. And, when we look at the analytics and reporting part of our operating model here, what you're talking about, just being able to show these different sorts of dials or metrics or dashboards of, here is the demand coming, here's our capacity. It shows everything in black and white so that you can have a really good conversation with stakeholders about why you can or cannot do something. And it's not just a, talk to the hand or everybody's busy type of anecdotal thing. It is, here's the data on what we're doing and how quickly we're doing it and how efficiently we're doing it. And if you can combine that with some of the impact that's being driven, then it can provide the justification for more investment from the right types of stakeholders. It can justify how to prioritize different types of work and why one thing might be more important than another. So I think what you're talking about in terms of being able to show this information and show data, it's so important in this model to have the visibility and the visualization of information to do that.
I was hoping you'd go there because I want you to expand a little bit on the secret sauce. You could have all the data in the world, but if you don't visualize it and render it in a way to make it consumable, it's going to be really, really hard. And that's the role Catherine has done exponentially well on a lot of these engagements, is working with our sponsor. We have to render the information in a way that they can articulate it. And that's really important. And it's underappreciated how important that rendering and the visualization of the different information in the talk track goes. What do you think, Catherine? Because you do a lot of that for us, right?
I do a lot of that. And I think that's, many years ago, I started becoming almost like a disciple of Edward Tufte, which if some people know him, I don't know, Simon, maybe you could put his name in the chat, where he wrote several books that were really about the visualization of quantitative information. That was literally a title of one of his books. But he really emphasized, how do you get insight out of information in a way that brings those key points home for the people who are looking at what they need to look at? And, using not just infographics, but just being able to look at data, interpret it, and then display it in a way that just cuts to the chase and cuts through the noise. And I think that part of it, it's so important to be able to do that for your different audiences. And it's going to look different for different audiences. Of course, where we've done a lot of this work is with executives, whether they're the ones funding something or whether they're the ones who are constituents who we just need to get in alignment with and understand the why behind a lot of things. That all of that gets wrapped up in visualizing the real insight that data is going to tell you. Which it's hard to just do that. But I think the link that Simon shared in the chat, there's this one, Tufte used to rail on PowerPoint as being an overly simplistic medium for information sharing. And back when he wrote that article, it's definitely true. I also think, we're looking at PowerPoint now, and you can make PowerPoint look pretty darn good. You just have to know how to use its different features and then ignore some of the other things that it shows. And don't just be lazy about what you're presenting. You got to really think about it.
What I love about all of this is we haven't talked about technology. We led with all the other things. Because a lot of times we see clients leading with technology because it's the easy, tangible, shiny object. I would love to hear your perspective, Catherine, from a sales enablement perspective, and you too, Juliana. What is our philosophy on technology? Because I've always fundamentally believed there's been redundant technology in organizations, and I try to get utilize what's available so we don't create yet another platform or system? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting with technology. We do have a huge proliferation, and I used to be in an IT function long before I was doing sales enablement, and the same problem existed back then during the tech boom, which is there was so much new technology and everybody was just buying it without really understanding its purpose. And you put that together with the models of funding for technology companies, they're the easiest thing for venture capitalists to fund. So naturally, you're going to have a lot of shiny objects out there in the marketplace, all saying that they can do this or that, and people spending most of their money on that. And the reality of it is that, and I think we've all experienced this with technology at the enterprise level, it's mostly pretty good. And a lot of it is you don't ever use the full capacity of something because of what is the other ingredient that it takes? It takes people to figure out how to best leverage a technology. And it takes not just people, but people working in concert with very consistent standards to be able to use technology. And those things often get pushed away, and the shiny object of the technology becomes the focus. And I think our position is more, technology is basically pretty good across the board. Features, functions, most of it, you could probably find 4 or 5 different solutions for whatever it is you need to do. So we remain fairly agnostic about technology. And we think that the investment in the stuff that happens in between the technology, the glue, if you will, is just as important, if not more important than any one technology solution.
Is it the interface, right? I mean, we had one client say, I just want that single pane of glass for all my audience members. We don't want to have one system for this person or that role or this role. Like, we want a single pane of glass one person can go to rather than navigating across multiple platforms.
Yeah, we do believe that to have a good experience for anybody, one place to go is always the best solution, especially for enablement, learning. You may have different applications that a person uses to do their job across the board, but when it comes to them learning on the job or learning at work, having one place to go, so much better. Otherwise, it gets very, very noisy, and that can be very hard to do. So we do think about the user interface and providing solutions for user interfaces that don't require another investment in technology. There's actually a webinar on that that we did a couple months ago, really talking about how do you build a user interface so that you can leverage all the wonderful things that you already have in your technology suite and just get the most out of that investment by giving the audience a single place to go and much easier for them.
I think on the technology side, from where somebody goes on a day-to-day basis, we can stitch the learning to be a part of that. And that's what we've done before. So looking at it from, again, the audience's perspective, where are they going? Where do they have to go on a daily basis? Where do you want them the most? You need to think through that and then be able to serve their enablement or their learning or whatever it is that they need within that platform. And that's what we've done the work on, is more that view, and then potentially, an overlay on top of it so that it is a better user experience for someone versus, adding on more and more stuff, because more than likely you have the technology today that can do what it is that you need to do. And, a lot of it has become kind of content management on the back end. And so a big part of what we think about is you have to have good content for people to use the technology.
Yep.
And technology is only as good as the people that use it, right? The irony of deciding that technology is the answer in a lot of these cases is that it's really literally only as good as the people actually using it, which I think kind of ties in another thing that's not on here, but is like so incredibly crucial to scaling a function, changing a function, modernizing a function, whatever it is that you're doing to your operating model. And we've touched on it in a lot of these different areas, but it's around the communications. A lot of people call it change management, and change happens. And that it is. And I would say it's more of a progressive elaboration because you're constantly hopefully changing, means you're growing and adding on. And so what does your, what does it look like when you have the analytics and reporting? A lot of that work that Catherine did was about communicating to other people what was going on. It wasn't, just the analytics and reporting. It was, okay, now that we have this, how do we present that to, the C-level audience? How do we present it down to the group so that they can understand their impact that these things are making? As we make changes and we shift this or shift that, how do we communicate where we're going? And how do we drive that so that there's not a lot of surprises? And it is extremely underrated in most cases. Technology is bought and implemented without telling anybody. It's the old adage that just keeps happening where the leaders are like, they announce a reorg and everybody's trying to, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And what happens to my role? And what happens to this? And the leaders are like, oh my gosh, can't they get it already? Because from a leadership perspective, you've been talking about it for a year potentially. And this has just finally made it to the implementation stage. So you have many, many, many answers that all of a sudden a huge group within your organization doesn't have any answers for. And so how do you make sure you're always ahead of that? And you're giving the information and drip feeding it at the right time in the right manner to all the different people that need it. And that's extremely complex to be successful at.
And that's where we talked at the front end of this conversation. This is kind of like two bookends. That shared service leader who we engage with, that's what transformative leaders do. They help navigate the change, the complexity, communicating outside the organization and communicating inside the organization, which when we've seen this done effectively and done well, it's when that shared service leader is doing both of those things. What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this idea of communication or change management, which to us, I think seem like words that need a little bit of a refresh. And, there is so much that can happen and that can be possible when you can bring people along and manage that through time, almost through, the expression of the values of, that your business stands for, that your organization stands for. And that aspect of it, I think, is super important and not to be ignored amongst the in the operating model.
I think that like kind of summarizes everything.
Yeah, I totally agree.
At least all the work that we've done. And there's more that we could talk about because I want to jump in. Catherine sent so much rendering of concepts or ideas in order to communicate them. And I think, when I was first starting out and I was like, I wonder what leaders are doing every day. I didn't think that this is what it was. It's like
Me too.
Figuring out how to communicate things to large audiences. It was like, I thought they were just constantly in this like visionary state of, doing something. And the reality is you're spending a lot of time clarifying, and getting it, getting something documented and messaged and out so that you can make change happen.
I'm laughing because I used to think naively, oh, they're working on business strategy, whatever that is.
Yeah,
when
always.
it's really the communications and the adjustments and reacting and responding and all the triangulation that goes on with all the different complexities of the organization and the stakeholders. And Catherine has been so helpful, as you point out, to make the renderings, to make those conversations go smoother. We do practice runs, right? When we do this well. And that's where all the lion's share of the work goes, but it really yields its value at the end of the modernization effort in terms of outcomes, measurable outcomes.
Yeah, it's good.
So obviously,
Simon, I think you can wrap us. Yeah.
We can keep talking about this for a long time, but of course, we're doing our best to parse out some of our content so we can continue to host these conversations and bring you all to them. So thank you to all three of you for the wonderful conversation. There's so much more that we have to share. A lot of it is published. You've seen some links in the chat as we've been going along here. And of course, there's a bunch more on our website. You can check out our blog. You can check out the other recorded webinars. All of those links are coming into the chat now. You'll find that we have a newsletter that publishes monthly. We promise not to spam you, so you can sign up for that as well. It'll let you know when we're doing more events like this, having more conversations and where we're going to be once we're as travel opens up more, or if it opens up more. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, those social media platforms. If that's where you like to hang out and connect with us, please definitely do that. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you again to Rob and Juliana and Catherine, and to everyone that joined us today. Stay in touch with us, please. We'd love to hear from you and love to know what you thought about today. You can connect with us, connect at oxygenexp.com, or reach out to any of us in all the ways that I've just listed in chat. Thanks everyone for being here.